Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Luxury Institute's webinar on Generation Z, Myths and Realities. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared following the session. The recording will also be available on Luxury Institute's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast. Please share any questions you have using the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address as many questions as we can during the last 10 minutes. If you'd like to connect privately to ask questions or share feedback, you can contact us directly. Now I'd like to hand it over to Luxury Institute CEO and DataLucent Chairman Milton Pedraza to welcome our speakers. Milton.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for joining us today. We'll try to make it, as always, insightful and entertaining. The topic today is Generation Z, Myths and Realities. And I think there's a lot of information out there that pertains to marketing and to the workplace. And so we invited two empirical researchers to help us today to navigate the landscape, to understand what is a myth, what is reality. And there may be no perfect answers, but there's certainly high probability responses and solutions that we're going to seek from our two speakers. So our two experts who are empirical researchers are Hana Ben-Shabat, who's founder of GenZ Planet, a consulting and research firm, and author of the book GenZ 360. And Megan Gerhardt, who's professor of leadership at Miami of Ohio University, is the founder and owner of the Gerhardt Group and the author of Gentelligence. Let's start by saying welcome to both of you. How do you define, Hana, Gen Z? Let's start with that and then Megan.
Sure. So I define Gen Z as everyone who was born from 1998 to 2016. The starting point is pretty much driven by when we start to actually see differences in behaviors and values in the data. And that's right about then. Also, 1998 is a very important year because that's the year that Google was incorporated. And that was a precursor to all the major innovations that came after and defined this generation. The end point in 2016 or 2015, it's still questionable. I would say is more because of the changes that we have seen on a global level and the greater sentiments of nationalism. So we saw Brexit, the rise of Donald Trump, China trade wars, and all these things somehow indicates a beginning of a new era.
Thank you. Megan?
I would, for the most part, agree. I use the Pew Research Center data years, so that would be 1997 to right now. They're saying 2012, but I'm leaning with Hana on this one. I think because of COVID and the pandemic impact, we're going to have to revise that date to be closer to 2016. I would only add that what we want to look at with generational divisions, and the reason it's more art sometimes than exact science, is we do look at these formative events. So I look at, for example, we wanted the millennials to all remember the turn of the millennium. That's why we had the end date about 1996 for millennials. And we will want all of our Gen Zs to remember, for better or for worse, the pandemic, which is why I think we're leaning more towards a 2016 date for the end there. So we're pretty aligned on that.
So that's about ages 5 to 23. Is that fair, ladies?
It's about right.
So now we've touched on it a little bit, but so what are the most influential events besides some of the ones you cited in the lives of Gen Z, and how have those events shaped them and their values and their behaviors?
Sure. So the formative events are always ones, they vary a little bit by culture. And so it's interesting to hear globally what some of those events might be, as well as depending on where you're sitting today. We would look at things like what's going on economically, politically, culturally, where you are. So certainly our Gen Zs growing up in the age of rampant social media, leading to questions about things like fake news. Where are they getting their information? Things like politically, we were talking about, depending on where you are, our views on leadership, parenting norms of the day. In the US, school violence is one we point to a lot. And then, of course, these are all young people whose education was disrupted by COVID. And so we are just now starting to see some of those impacts. And I would add to that, Gen Z is taking a look at what the millennials went through, the fact that some of the paths and choices they made seem to work well, some seem to work not so well, and they are shaping their reaction because of it. So I think we're seeing a generation that is very socially conscious, of course, tech savvy, that is not new, but even more so in terms of how to leverage technology for the goals and purposes that they care about. And we will see, as you said, they range from 9 to 23 to 24. So that's still an unfolding story that we're seeing. They will be both similar and different to the millennials, I think, in really interesting and important ways.
And what are the top 3 ways that you see? Because there's a lot there to unpack. So what are 3 ways, like if I wanted to stereotype them, what are 3 things that you would tell me about Gen Zs that are unique?
I would say the first thing is diversity. Just a pure fact, demographically, this is the most diverse generation to ever live in the United States. 48% are minorities. So that's, I think, impact the way they view the world, the way what they expect from the world around them, either when they're in schools or they look for a job, or what they expect from brands. The second thing is quite obvious, is connectivity. This is a generation that doesn't know a world without a search engine, mobile phone, or social media. And that shapes everything, how they think, how they learn, how they process information, how they communicate with each other, how they form relationships, and so on. And I think the third thing for me is that is a result of the second, because of the connectivity and because of the exposure that they have to the world to the world around them, they are more willing to question things and to engage and as a result more socially conscious. So very high engagement.
Thank you. Megan, what about your 3?
Ooh, top 3. I think I would say I would agree with the socially conscious, absolutely. And I think I would say, you know, we want to think about the lens they're going to use to view the world. So I think that they will be both more risk averse than we've seen in the past, given the, you know, and I think depends on how we define risk. I think in terms of the careers they're going to have, I think in terms of the amount of risk they're willing to take in certain ways, but I also think relevant to our audience today and relevant to the work that the Luxury Institute does, I don't think that they define risk in things like privacy rights exactly the way that older generations did. I think they grew up believing their entire lives would be probably shared online, and they don't expect the same level of privacy maybe that we had in the past. They're not as concerned about that in the same ways. So I think they're both risk averse in terms of career path, but an educational path, but more maybe bold and transparent and open about things like their privacy. So those are a couple things. I don't know if that was 2 or 3, Milton, but
no, that's
I'll
perfect. So then let me ask you this, you know, there is a theme about authenticity, you know, being genuine, being yourself, that has been attributed to Gen Zs. Is that true?
Yes, totally.
Tell us more.
And I think that, you know, the word authenticity has been used, almost overused so much with this generation, to the point that it lost its meaning. But I believe that authenticity is one of the most important things that this generation what this generation is about. And I think this is a generation that grew up with social media and celebrity culture, and they grew up to resent it and to question it because they view it as fake and they don't want to be that. Many of the Gen Z I interviewed and I speak to every day keep on telling me that they don't like this mentality of, you know, living for the post, having the best selfie, the best vacation spot, and showing everything on social media as if it's perfect. Their preference is be yourself. And in fact, if you check on TikTok today, be yourself videos with hashtag be yourself have 2 billion views. Wow. Which tells you the mindset of this generation. And so it's all about be yourself, be authentic. And because that's what they expect from themselves, they want they expect it from others, and especially they expect it from brands.
Interesting. Megan, can you follow up on that? Authenticity?
I agree, particularly when it comes to things like, my focus is always on the workplace, and certainly when they are seeking out companies to work for, they want value alignment around, and I think this would be true with the brands that they also are loyal to. They want to see themselves in that. I think it is interesting that the word authentic is evolving, right? So we have seen so many instances of people putting only the best parts of themselves online for other people to see. And the pushback of that is really fascinating. I think that's what, in part to go to our earlier question, that's what marks a generation, right? Is when suddenly they stand up and say, well, we don't like that, we're going to do this differently. And they start moving in a slight different direction. It's almost like a pendulum that pushes back. And so I find that really interesting. I also think I always want to be aware of the fact that I think generational identity is incredibly powerful and important as a lens, but age is as well. So we may see our younger Gen Zs feeling even more the way Hana expressed than the older ones who maybe grew up under a lot of that influencer shadow and are trying to navigate how to be authentic in light of that kind of pressure or that kind of context.
So let's look then a little bit at the older Gen Zs, because they're in a position to have purchasing power, maybe from teens to young adults. What inspires them? Who are their heroes? What are the things that inspire them, Hana?
I would say that Gen Z, because of growing up with technology and being able to be super creative with the tools and the technologies that they have in their hands, they are very inspired by creativity. So things like art and photography and music are very important to this generation from a content perspective. And I think in terms of role models, they are inspired by people of their own age who were able to create movements, if you like. So Greta Thunberg on one hand, but also artists like Billie Eilish. She became a spokesperson to so many important issues like mental health or body positivity, which this generation is really grappling with. So they inspired by them. I think the other kind of inspiration, kind of in the context of what you guys are doing in the Luxury Institute, one of the very admired individual is Virgil Abloh. And I think one of the reasons, and it's really fascinated me actually to understand, because it's one thing to like the products that he makes, but one of the things that is very appealing to them is the fact that he's kind of a modern type of a Renaissance man. He's an architect, he's a DJ, he's a designer, he's an artist. And I think that a possibility that the world today offer young people, that I don't have to just select one profession and stick to it. I can also do other things and be different things, is something that is very appealing to them. One thing that you hear Gen Z always say is that I don't want to be put in a box. And I think Virgil Abloh is really a representation of that. You can't put him in a box because he's so many things.
Fascinating. Megan, tell us a little bit about their inspiration in the workplace. So we see a lot of trends today, some driven by COVID. We see a lot of young people quitting without a job. Millennials kind of started that, but it seems to be rampant with young Gen Zs. And so risk, like defining. And also in terms of education, you're a professor. Is it worth going to college? I read that even, God forbid, Columbia University degrees in certain subjects are just not paying out. So tell us a little bit about education, jobs, and how the Gen Zs, the older Gen Zs, are behaving, their attitudes and behaviors, please.
Yes, so our Gen Zs, as I said, are looking at the millennials and saying, did that behavior work out for them? So let's start educationally. We're seeing more and more Gen Zs look closely at whether a traditional four-year degree makes sense for them. Now, as a professor, I hope that, a large proportion of them still believe that it does, but what we're seeing is them realizing there's many paths to a career. So educationally, we are seeing more and more Gen Zs pursuing areas we haven't seen be popular for a while. So for example, one I'm seeing a lot is skilled trades. So if we think about electricians, plumbers, carpenters, if you think about most people you know who you call to come, fix your sink or be an electrician are older. They are, 60 plus, because millennials and Gen Xers were not encouraged to go into that as a sustainable, successful career path. Many of their parents wanted them to do something different, to go to college, to do, something more than perhaps they or their parents had. And so there's a cycle there, leaving a huge talent pipeline gap. And a huge need for those positions. And so, for example, my nephew is a senior in high school, and he is thinking of apprenticing as a welder because there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of money, and that's where there are definite jobs, right? So when I say risk averse, where are the jobs? If I'm going to take a traditional job, what's one that I'm definitely going to be able to get a return on my training investment? We talk in our book about the existence of what are now called new collar jobs. So not blue collar or white collar, but jobs that require high-tech training, but not a 4-year traditional degree. So Google's coursework that they are making available is a great example of this. So we're seeing that. In terms of workplace, a couple of different mentalities. I think one is the idea of increased internships. We've been seeing this at the university for several years, where now students expect that they will need multiple years of internship before finding the right place, mostly so they can try out some different opportunities. Again, a little bit more careful about, is this really what I want to do? And then I think finally, 2 other trends I would point us to think about. One is the fact that we are in sort of the LinkedIn culture. I'm seeing so powerfully with our Gen Zs at college age, so much pressure on the announcement they're going to make about the job they get upon graduating. I'm happy to announce that I've accepted a position at company X. It's like their Instagram moment, but on LinkedIn. And so much pressure about getting that right. And will it be impressive? And how will that be perceived by family and friends in terms of the identity or the brand, so to speak, of that company? And then finally, something worth noting in terms of a timeline is, because many of our older Gen Z started careers or are starting careers virtually, the ability to onboard them and get them to really feel loyal to an organization in terms of an employer is very hard. If you've never stepped foot in an office, how loyal do you feel to that employer? I anticipate we're going to be seeing, with the Great Resignation, a lot of Gen Zs being even more into job hopping than we accuse the millennials of being, because they're just not being given an opportunity to really build those bonds.
Thank you. I do have an example for you. I was recently at a luxury hotel I won't name, and I got into a conversation with one of the staff members. And I asked him, so, do you plan a career here? He said, no, sir. He said, I finished my 4 years of college. I didn't go to a great college. But now what I do part-time after I get out of this job, is I go and I apprentice, and I'm going to be a plumber. And sir, I'm going to be affluent because I'm going to start at $120,000 a year. So that kind of encompasses some of what you said. And he was probably 21 or 22. He did finish college, so maybe 23. But that was his path. So he was really examining some of the issues and elements you described. So now let's switch to, there's a lot of luxury and premium brand executives here from all over the world. So tell us about the relationship that Gen Zs have with luxury brands. You started a little bit on that, but what are their expectations? How do they consider a purchase? And how do they feel about long-term relationships with brands? What are the elements that drive building a relationship? And I'm not talking about intimate, but having a long-term relationship. I will buy Gucci for a long time. I will go to Ritz-Carlton for a long time. Hannah, tell us a little bit about that.
So I think it's very interesting to see the relationship that Gen Z has with luxury, how it actually evolved over time. If you ask me 5 years ago, I would say Gen Z view luxury as a very kind of, luxury is a show off, and we don't want luxury as we know it. We are looking for more understated luxury. And a lot of it still today, But in the past couple of years, what I see is that many Gen Zers look at luxury as assets and investment. And that is fascinating, because they don't look at it anymore as a consumption. I just want to have a product and enjoy it or show it off or whatever relationship you have with the brand. It is more about kind of, is this item has a long-term value? And because they're still young, and the affluent segment is probably smaller at this point, many of them access luxury through the resale market, which is another interesting phenomenon that Gen Z is driving. So they are very active in places like Depop or the Real, where they actually can buy these things. And they look at luxury in a much broader sense than we used to talk about when we talking luxury 10 or 20 years ago, because it's not only anymore the Gucci and Prada and LVMH, it's also about art and collectible, because those things have long-term value. So I think the relationship with luxury, I would say, is evolving, but it's taking a very interesting twist over the past couple of years.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, what I think is interesting is, of course, this idea of how do things like sustainability and social responsibility merge with that. So I would agree that in the resale, we're seeing the idea of being able to get something that's not contributing to creating something new that maybe we don't feel like we want to contribute to. But also, I'm watching closely, how does this compare to what we saw from the millennials, which was this idea that we mostly just want to be able to take a picture of it, right? We don't need to own it, or we don't need to accumulate. We just want to have the experience of taking a picture with it, or taking a picture in front of it, or posting it as if we own it. And so I'm sort of interested to see how that evolves. I do think there is something very strong in Gen Z about, who am I? Right? Am I a person who wears this luxury brand or is loyal to a particular organization or company that believes what I believe? And it matters a lot to me, because just like posting my job announcement on LinkedIn, I want to post a picture of myself on Instagram or a reel on TikTok about myself with this, because I want to be associated with it. So I think really value alignment is very important to this generation, whether it's in where they work or what they wear. And I think a lot of it isn't just buying it and enjoying it for themselves. I still believe they're very much into, how do I leverage social media to share with the world this sort of curated vision of myself, and whether that's aspirational or currently authentic, I think is an interesting question to explore, but that would be my take on it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to name names on the positive side. So Hana, what brands do you see or do you hear from Gen Zers are resonating with them, are brands that, at least for in the moment, they really appreciate?
So on the premium luxury, I would say Gucci and Nike will be the top brands. And to relate to what Megan was saying, it has a lot to do about the ecosystems that these brands were able to create, and not only about their products. I think the willingness that both Nike and Gucci have to express very clear views about issues that matter to this generation is one thing that is very appealing. Nike never hesitated to express their view and position about racial issues. And they have done that in a very consistent manner over the years. And that is something that a socially conscious generation really care about. Gucci is the same. In 2019, they took the whole topic of reproductive freedom to the catwalk, which was a huge thing, because they've done it in Italy, a country where abortions were not allowed, and and they were not allowed until 1969. And I think one of the things that they displayed in the catwalk was the 1969 timeline. And I think that was really fascinating. And that was before what's happening right now in Texas. So I think that courage, the willingness to be courageous as a brand really appeal to this generation. I think if we go a little bit outside of the luxury segment, you can still see that authenticity, like brand authenticity, plays a huge role in what is appealing to Gen Z. And I always give the example of Aerie, which is a great brand, and they have very, very clear message about woman empowerment, body positivity, being real and being authentic. And everything this brand does is to live by these statements. Is their advertising, is the content they deliver to their consumers. Everything works in sync. So when a Gen Zer looks at that, it makes sense because there is a complete alignment between what the brand does and what the brand says. And that's basically is the basis for building trust with consumers, especially with this generation.
Thank you. And Megan, I'm not going to put you on the spot with brands because I know that you deal more with workplace. So I am going to put you on the spot with employers. Tell us a little bit about what their expectations are from employers. We talked a little bit about it, but you know, there's a long-term career here. What are some employers that might resonate, or maybe what do employers need to do in a time where they almost act like gig workers, right? And right. You said they're virtual. There's a lot of, let's say, loyalty elements that maybe we lost, that maybe even millennials have to some degree, although millennials would quit without a job too. But so when you look at the teen, like my son is 15 to the top age of the Gen Zs, maybe 23, 24. What do we need to do as employers? And especially in fields like travel and leisure, where we've had a lot of shutdowns, and in restaurants, in high-end restaurants, even I went to Gramercy Tavern and Union Square Cafe, and they were understaffed. I've stayed at hotels that are luxury, they're understaffed, they're struggling. What would you advise them to do?
So I think when you think about what should an employer do to attract and retain Gen Z talent, the answer is this is a generation who is very much into developing themselves, what's possible for them, defining who they are as individuals. We touched upon this a little bit. So we're seeing really that they want to find a place to work where they believe they will be developed and invested in, just like our millennials did. You know, you have to understand that this is a generation like the millennials that were raised really as the center of a family unit, right? Their self-esteem, their concerns, their interests, their potential is still very central to families and this is obviously higher socioeconomic families specifically. And so you invest in these young people their whole lives. And then when it's time for them to go work, they want to find some place that's going to invest in them as well. And so they're not subscribing to, whether or not we like it, they are not subscribing to the put your head down, we'll tell you when it's time for you to get promoted or have more development or have new responsibility. And just like millennials, we can view this as entitled, but they view it as proactive. And that's a big disconnect, right? They view it as this is how we were raised to live and be successful. So it's not right or wrong. It's all about the lens we use to view it. And they are very much about, is this a place where I can see myself growing, learning, and contributing? So it's not just about what they can learn from us, but they want places that are interested in their perspective, that believe their unique voice and their experience as young people growing up in this new world can add value. And so they're looking for mutual respect. They're looking for a place that they can contribute very early. So I think we'll continue to see companies that have things like leadership rotational programs, or programs where you get certain experiences in service of getting a promotion or a leadership role earlier than most of us would have expected that. So that's what they want. They want that development. And I think we once again, generation after generation, we cannot assume loyalty. because they may view their career as something they're going to really piece together based on opportunities that present themselves. And we may see them, working remotely. What we're seeing now, a lot of them working, of course, remotely. You work remotely, that opens up the possibility you can be doing some gig work simultaneously on the side. So I think for employers, really thinking about how to keep them engaged and also what your parameters are going to be. If they're going to be able to work remotely, do we care if they're doing other gig work in addition to the work they're doing for us? And being too confining may lead them to decide that's not a place that they want to work.
So it's really fascinating to me because as a boomer, I grew up in corporations where the theme was suck it up, survival of the fittest. They did train us like SEALs. So you do it this way, and this is the only way to do it. I would be blunt and say minorities did not have the same opportunities. They were like, this is the track for you, Mr. Minority and Miss Minority. Oh, and by the way, that's the track for all the other people who are winners. So now I'm a generation and I have to deal with a son who is a Gen Z, but also people who will come to work with me who are Gen Zs. So what advice would you give in this? Because I know you study, Megan, multi-generational interaction and how to optimize that, So what is it that the boomer, Gen X leadership, and maybe millennial leadership has to do to inspire, to attract and inspire and retain all of these young people? What do we need to do? How do we adapt, or what is it that we do? We came from wear a helmet, life is tough, you're gonna get tackled. And by the way, get up, oh, you're bleeding? Oh, too bad, broken arm? Don't worry, we'll take care of it later. Just finish the game. All of that seems to be going away. And so what are the new leadership skills that are required?
Sure. So we talk about this in the book. We talk about 4 practices, and I'll just summarize and make them succinct for us today. But a lot of it is resisting assumptions that you truly understand where somebody a lot older or younger is coming from. So we talk about it being a two-way street. We got to champion all generations, but also adjusting your lens, that the way you see things is based on the time and place, in part based on the time and place you grew up in the world. And so you're going to see it in a way that's fundamentally different. Just as you were traveling across the world, your lens is different than those of people who grew up differently. And so we encourage people to be judgmental, not to be judgmental, but to be curious about, interesting, I don't understand that behavior, or that's not how I would have approached that or phrased that or done that. Instead of judging, well, that's wrong. What's wrong with kids these days? Taking a pause and saying, let me see if I can understand where that's coming from. And I think the most important thing there, Milton, is that there are universal needs. Research shows that across every generation, we have needs for respect, for connection, for autonomy. And that is whether you're a Z or a boomer or anywhere in between. What is different, and where we get a disconnect and often conflict, is how different generations pursue fulfillment of those needs. So whereas you put your head down, did your work until somebody tapped you on the shoulder and said, okay, you can have this responsibility or this promotion, our Gen Zs were raised to rush into your office and say, what more can I do? I'm ready for this. I have a great idea for you. And so that is how they try to fulfill the need for respect. They believe that is how you get respect, is you run in and you contribute and you're energetic. Whereas that wasn't the norm when boomers were growing up. You got respect.
No, I was told that young product managers don't speak at any meeting until they're spoken to. And probably you won't be spoken to during the entire meeting. You're here to listen and learn and be quiet. So that's a huge shift.
I think that's really is the challenge right now in the workplace. And I talk about it a lot in my book, that you have these 4 generations, and each generation has different values and different perceptions of what a good employee actually means. And there is also a lot of unconscious bias. Even if you have people completely saying the right things, like Megan was stating, and say, oh, I'm trying to understand, there is a lot of unconscious bias. And unfortunately, the more senior positions, people in the more senior position have the most bias. towards young people. So I believe that the only way to actually solve this issue is to raise awareness among all levels of employees and through all generations, and to do it through really open conversation that on one hand allow people to understand where each generation comes from, but at the same time, as Megan stated, to identify the commonalities. Because in the end of the day, there are so many things that unite us just as human beings that companies can actually build on to create an harmonious workplace.
Well, you make me think that obviously I'm raising a Gen Z and he's raising me in a way, right? Because he's influencing me as much as I'm influencing him in many good ways. And we see that in particularly in well-educated families, but I think everywhere where the younger generations are really affecting the purchase and the social values of the older generations. So my question would be, does a level of experience, in other words, here I am as a Gen Z, and I want to contribute and I want to give you my ideas. Very often the tendency of older generations is to say, well, you learn first and then contribute. Do they accept that, or is it just much more of a dynamic process? Megan?
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I would say, I think it's much more of a dynamic process. I think my favorite phrase, if we're looking for sort of strategies people can try this later today or tomorrow, is, you listen. So I work with Gen Zs every day in my classroom and beyond. And so they'll come running with an idea, or they have this great, perspective that they want to contribute. And so listening and then saying, okay, tell me how you would do that, right? I'm open. I want to hear. I value your perspective. I believe you have unique experience and expertise. I want to hear you. I'm going to ask you questions. I start by being curious. And then by being curious and respectful and listening, instead of saying, hey, be quiet, sit down, you just got here, you don't know anything yet, and shutting that down, by opening and asking, well, how would you do it? I'm really interested in what you think. One, I'm going to learn something, to be honest, right? Like we have to step away from this lens that you can't learn anything from people younger than you because they just got there. They know all kinds of things we don't know because they grew up differently than we did. Now, by being respectful of that and listening, I then have a much better shot at saying, I love that idea. I'm intrigued by your, suggestion that we do X and Y. I had not thought of that. Let me raise a few challenges I think we're going to face, right? So now I'm speaking from my expertise of having been here, 20 or 30 years. Things about, I don't know that our organization would let us do that. So that's a roadblock we're going to need to work around, or legally that's actually not allowed. How would we, work through that? And by building that trust, that's one of our Gentelligence practices, by building that trust that she's really listening to me and she really does appreciate and value my ideas, then they're going to respect and trust my feedback that maybe, I think a really big misperception is that Gen Zs don't think older people know anything. I think they very much want to be mentored and learn and respect to some extent, but they respect those that respect them, right? And so they no longer have this idea of power distance that older generations had, that just because you're the boss or just because you're older, you must know something or you must be respected. But they very much want to learn, and they want to learn from people that are interested in connecting with them and who are interested in mutual learning and sort of collaboration would be my take on that.
And Hana?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. I tend to agree to that. I mean, this is a generation that is naturally have a tendency to question everything. And I always say, when they come and ask you why we are doing something the way we are doing it, they are not going to accept an answer because that's what we've been doing for 50 years. It's just not going to fly with this new generation. So I think listening to them, and instead of dismissing any new ideas, identifying ways to allow them to contribute is going to be the right the right way to go. I would say, I would add to that point that if you are not going to do that, the likelihood that they're actually going to stay in your organization is very slim, because they don't have the patience or the interest in being in a place where they are not feeling that they are heard and respected and being valued. So I think if you want to keep them in the workforce, you better adjust the attitude towards what they want to say or what they have to say.
Provocative question and short answer, because I have more questions for you. And some of them are coming from the audience. So are Gen Zs more emotionally intelligent? By that I mean more empathic, maybe trustworthy, more generous than other generations, or is that a false claim? Megan?
I haven't seen, since you asked us here as empirical researchers, yes, Milton, totally. I have not seen data supporting that that's true. I'm not saying there isn't data around there. I would have to look at it.
Okay.
I think to some extent, I would say, and I do lots of speaking on emotional intelligence, that part of emotional intelligence is developed over time. And so that's not to say that our Gen Zs aren't potentially coming in with certain elements of emotional intelligence more natural to them. Maybe because particularly I've written some things about their willingness to speak up, as you said, about things like mental health that prior generations have felt were very taboo, that they're not subscribing to that. They're much more self-aware, and also their self-management doesn't subscribe to certain things being off limits to talk about. So I think in that way, we're seeing a different level of self-management, or a different interest in socially managing what we share. I think that social awareness of what's acceptable to share is evolving really rapidly, for better or for worse. I'm not saying it's necessarily always better, but certainly the progress on things like mental health is. But I think that emotional intelligence is the one aspect of leadership that we know can be developed over time. There's plenty of research on that. And so part of that is through experience, particularly the relationship management element of it. And I think the element that our Gen Zs, regardless of who they are, probably need the most experience with is how do you manage relationships and develop trust and handle conflict in a way that's going to still keep that trust intact, whether that's with a brand or with an employer or with each other. So I don't think that I would make a sweeping statement that they're more emotionally intelligent. I think there are elements of emotionally intelligent behavior that we're seeing in them that we didn't see at other generations at such a young age. Mm-hmm. But I think just like all of us, they will need the benefit of time and experience to develop some of those other elements of their emotional intelligence.
So Hana, I'm going to ask you a little bit.
I would actually say that yes. I would make a sweeping statement. Okay. I think this is a generation that is more empathic, and I think it's really directly correlated to the level of exposure that they had at a very young age to world troubles and issues and gun violence in the United States and so on and so forth. In my book, I would like to actually support that with some data. In the process of writing my book, in my research, I always ask the participants to answer one question: what is your biggest dream? And I collected thousands of answers to that question over the years mm-hmm. that I'm researching Gen Z. And I can tell you categorically that a lot of these dreams have not much to do with the individual self, but more about what they want to see in the world. They want to see a better place. They want to see, many of them are coming from single parents family. I had a lot of dreams about, I want to see my mom happier. I want to support my family when I grow up. I want to be able to give back to the people who raised me. There are a lot, of course, there are lots of dreams about, I want to be rich. I want to be an Instagram influencer. Mm-hmm. And you can find some of those of those statements in my book. But I think that one of the things that struck me going to thousands of dream statements is how the other directedness is so big part of who they are, how much they care about what surrounds them and less about what each one of them is going to achieve individually.
I'm going to ask you a social media question, but Megan, you want to add something to that quickly?
Yeah, really quickly. I like the idea about empathy. I think that's true, more collectivist for sure. I do have a question for us to consider about how exposure to all of these big world events, at some point, does that also make them slightly more numb to them? How over time that's going to affect always being exposed to all of this, on a global scale. So just some food for thought there for sure.
We're rounding the circle. We're finishing the circle. So I have a question for you that I hadn't anticipated. I was going to ask you about data and AI and technological innovation, but the fact that there's a lot of research that Facebook did and that the Wall Street Journal exposed. So I'm trying to figure out, so there are a lot of young Gen Zs on social media, let's say Facebook, TikTok. They perceive a lot of negative effects from that, but they still are engaged. So I'm trying to reconcile that in my head. Maybe there's a very simple answer, but why do they keep going back to a place where they find relatively toxic?
Did you hear about addiction?
Yes, so tell me more. Tell me more. You're the expert.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things happening at the same time. First of all, I think it's very important to clarify where Gen Z is mostly, and they are not so much on Facebook. They are on Instagram, and recently there is a huge migration to TikTok. And I think part of this migration can be explained by the issues that you are describing. And it's going back to where we started in a way, which is the authenticity. One of the things that I believe explain why TikTok has been such a huge success with this generation is because you can be who you are on TikTok. You don't have to have those perfect images, this fake lifestyle that kind of you're driven to on Instagram. So I think probably from a mental health perspective, TikTok may be like a better place. I think what the journal has identified is the fact that there are always going to be people who are gravitated to what I call the Instagram culture, and it can be it can have very negative effect on their life, because what you're going to see people who look beautiful with perfect bodies, and after a while it starts creating insecurities. And this is a generation that already we're starting with some issues of mental health, so it just gets things even worse. And it's very hard for young people who don't have the ability to kind of stop to actually break that cycle. So yes, they go back. And I think that's kind of go back to education. And I'm sure Megan will have a very strong opinion about that, and to parenting. How do you guide your child in terms of usage of this platform? And are you able to spot the signs when something is starting to go wrong? Because some people ended committing suicide because of social media.
Thank you, Hannah. I don't want to be so negative about it. So Megan, give us a little perspective, and then I'm going to hand it to Katie, because there are a couple of questions. I've been asking questions that I saw throughout, but Katie has a couple more. So Megan, talk to me about Facebook and TikTok and engagement.
Yeah, so I will say one of the things that I was really struck by, I had this conversation with my students a couple of weeks ago, was I think on the positive side of this, one of the opportunities social media gives Gen Zs is the opportunity to find their tribe of people. So if we step away from massive influencers with millions of followers, I think it's the idea that, they suddenly have a very powerful tool and broad reach to find maybe people that they can be micro influencers to, or that can be micro influencers to them. That's a term that my Gen Z students introduced me to, in terms of people who love what I love, even if it's a unique, special, it's a niche thing. I can find those people, that tribe of people on TikTok or on Instagram, who share my passions and interests, where I can create a community, and I'm connected in a way that I'm not at my high school or at my college because I have this. So I think on a positive side, it gives them access to finding, their people, so to speak, that love what they love. And
I've seen that. Yes.
I think that kind of opportunity in social media could be good for our mental health, and our emotional intelligence.
Thank you. I know it's a tough question and there are no easy answers, but there are some clear answers of what to do. Katie, I'm going to hand it back to you to ask some of the remaining questions. So please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah and Megan. Really interesting question. A lot have been addressed already, but one of the ones that I love that came in is, what do we know about how Gen Z looks at saving versus spending their money? Are they focusing more on saving for big purchases, or are they spending to enjoy today?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or I'm sorry, Hannah, go ahead. You can start first.
Yeah, I think that's the answer is definitely they are focused on savings. As I said earlier, this is a generation that grew up, at least the older Gen Z grew up during the 2008 recession, and they are now experiencing the economic effects of COVID-19. And as a result, they are extremely focused on securing their financial future. As Megan said earlier, they look at the millennials, they look at what worked for them and what didn't work for them, and they are really trying to learn from past generations' mistakes. So savings is a huge priority. What they set for varies a lot, but many of them are savings for big purchases like cars and house. And one of the very interesting statistics that just came a couple of weeks ago from a company called Better Mortgages, where they said that Gen Z applications for mortgages is the fastest growing segment and has grown almost 120% between this year compared to last year. So we are seeing them trying to build financial assets, trying to secure their future, and they are very cautious when they spend money.
Yeah, the only sort of other additional thing I would say, I think that goes back to them being a little more risk averse in nature in certain ways. I think we also do have to remember, as much as we get excited about wanting to project sort of habits onto Gen Z, lifetime habits, the oldest of them are 23, 24 years old. And so there's a life cycle difference here. And I'm of course all about generational identity and why it's important. But we also always have to be mindful that probably the spending habits of someone who's, let's say, 18 to 23 to 24 haven't quite stabilized yet. So I think we will see them over time having that more risk averse, getting the house, being more cautious about going into student debt, things like that. But we also do have to remember we're talking about 9 to 24-year-olds here, so we can't project a lot, but I do think we're seeing early signs of that. I agree with Hannah on that.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all for contributing your questions. Really appreciate it. Milton, I'll hand it back to you to close today's session.
Thank you, Katie. So Hana Ben-Shabat, author of GenZ 360, and Megan Gerhardt, author of Gentelligence. I strongly recommend you read the book. I know some of our participants love your books. So I just want to say thank you for your insights. We look forward to another conversation soon to catch up on Gen Z and all the other generations. Thank you all.